Pokemon game analysis is really weird. Every game in the franchise has been so similar to all of the previous ones that pretty much everyone who wants to buy a new game will have made their decision before the game even comes out. These people typically fall into one of three categories: kids who just love the Pokemon themselves, adults trapped by their own nostalgia, and competitive players wanting to keep up with the latest changes. In all of these cases, everybody pretty much either already knows what they're getting into or don't care. And so for the last 10 years, Pokemon reviews have been pretty superficial across the board. Reviewers talk about whether they like the new Pokemon, the region, and the characters in what really just amounts to a summary of the wiki. Which is strange, because every game mostly consists of old Pokemon anyway. The regions all feature the exact same areas for the most part, or are too shallow to be worth even talking about, and the characters and stories are all so bland and have so little impact that you would be better off just ignoring them and hoping you don't get interrupted too much. When it comes down to it, all of these supposedly core aspects of a Pokemon game are just window dressing for what has been the same core gameplay experience for 20 years. Unlike literally every other game in existence, Pokemon games aren't actually judged for their gameplay. Pokemon is the only franchise I know of that gets this free pass from real criticism. But if you actually take a minute to dig into these games, you'll quickly realize that they do everything in their power to not be fun games. They don't do a good job of teaching the player the rules of the world, they actively discourage creativity and growth from the player, and they force players to torture themselves for hours if they want to actually make the most of the game. And that's true for every single Pokemon game ever made. Look, I'm not suggesting that the games have to be completely redone from scratch or anything, but in the last 20 years, the developers have done almost nothing to fix fundamental issues with their original design. The few changes that were made were ultimately just meaningless, flashy features that don't meaningfully change the gameplay. But Pokemon games are objectively bad games. These games can and should be much better than they are, but the franchise hasn't been held accountable for it. Despite what I've said about the original games having a lot of significant problems, I don't really hold any of that against them. Back in the 80s and 90s, games didn't have nearly the same level of refinement as they do today. There were a lot of reasons for that, but one of the biggest ones was how limited the computational resources were at the time. Even fairly simple games with borderline unintelligible graphics pushed consoles to the limits of what they were capable of. On top of that, games were really expensive to make and tended to have really tight deadlines. But despite all of that, there was still an expectation that games would provide dozens of hours of entertainment, so developers had to cut a lot of corners and find ways to squeeze more time out of short games. With JRPGs like Pokemon, the main way this was done was by baking in some level of randomness or grinding that forced players to repeat simple tasks dozens or even hundreds of times, artificially inflating the time it takes to beat a game by several hours. Now, despite the fact that this wasn't really fun for players, and I think most developers today would agree that it's bad game design, this tactic was actually really effective. By making things take way longer than they should, games tricked players into feeling like even simple tasks were significant accomplishments. It's a cheap and manipulative tactic that makes games seem more satisfying than they really are, but it was really important because the longer playtimes helped justify the high price games needed to be profitable. Pokemon was born in that era when hardware was severely limited, especially on handheld devices. But despite the constraints of the time, the creators of Pokemon were able to create a game with 151 unique playable characters and a substantial world to explore filled with trainers who would fight you using a fairly complex battling system. The fact that the developers packed in as much content as they did into a Game Boy game is honestly an impressive achievement, and it's understandable that they ended up having to cut corners with randomness and grinding to stay within the budget and on time. The problem is that instead of modernizing those problematic mechanics as hardware restrictions became less severe, Pokemon games doubled down on them. Grinding is now basically the core gameplay for the Pokemon franchise. That starts with Pokemon's level-based battling system. In general, levels are a convenient way to provide a sense of progression through a game, but it doesn't work that well if you can't control the rate at which the character grows. If the player can get stronger at whatever rate they want, then having enemies with set levels will either be too strong for most players, which forces the players to grind to get to the right level for their opponents, or too weak, in which case the entire game is basically just grinding to get to the end. Either way, you force players to waste a lot of time in tedious battles to progress. And Pokemon has always really struggled with this problem. Many of the early games in the franchise are brutally difficult and require you to spend hours very slowly leveling up your Pokemon to stand any sort of chance against most bosses. The more recent games have taken the opposite approach and have been excessively easy, with the grinding basically built in, assuming you always use the same Pokemon, and if you switch Pokemon, you'll again end up wasting time grinding on the side. Regardless of the approach, the design of these games is at its core fundamentally broken, because the games boil down to being glorified chores. And honestly, I could end this section here, because even if everything else in these games was perfect, this single problem is so fundamental that it's basically enough to ruin the entire game. But the rest of these games were made by the same people who thought that this system was acceptable, so everything else was also designed to take way more time than was necessary. Aside from battling, catching Pokemon is probably the most important part of these games. The tagline of Pokemon is literally gotta catch 'em all, so you'd think they'd try to make catching Pokemon an interesting experience for the player. Instead, we're still stuck with a system that was honestly barely acceptable when the original games came out 25 years ago. Every Pokemon has a predetermined chance of appearing in a specific area, and you have no real way of changing the odds. So if you're looking for a specific rare and powerful Pokemon, instead of there being some sort of challenge you have to accomplish to earn this Pokemon, you're just going to be doing the exact same thing dozens of times until the Pokemon you're looking for happens to appear. Then, as if that wasn't already a convoluted waste of time, you're not guaranteed to catch a Pokemon if you find it. When you try to catch a Pokemon, there's usually only a small chance that you actually catch them, even if you've already weakened the Pokemon and essentially beaten them. In the newer games, the rarest Pokemon, which take the longest to find, also only give you one chance to catch them. And considering how long it takes to find those Pokemon, since, again, they appear randomly, you might end up spending hours trying to catch one stupid Pokemon. And then there's the process for making what are called competitively viable Pokemon. We don't really have to go into the specifics here, but basically Pokemon you catch can be made significantly stronger if they happen to have certain traits. These traits can basically single-handedly determine whether your Pokemon is going to be really strong or essentially unusable. So as you can imagine, it's really important to get the right traits if you want to, say, compete in online tournaments against thousands of other real people. The insane thing is that these traits are given to your Pokemon completely randomly. And while there are ways to improve your odds of getting the ones you want, ultimately the most you can do is improve the odds slightly, meaning most of the time you're going to need to spend even more time to get a good Pokemon on top of what is already an excessively long process for catching them. But here's the real kicker. All of these problems have been present in every single Pokemon game ever made. The developers of these games have had the opportunity to fix any of them, or even all of them, in every game released since the originals, and have repeatedly chosen not to fix anything. This leads me to believe that the developers, for some insane reason, think these mechanics are actually fun and important to keep in these games. If they didn't, they probably would have removed them by now, right? But at the same time, every game since the originals has added at least one, but usually multiple mechanics designed specifically to make these problems easier to manage. Experience sharing items to spread out level gain between multiple team members, balls with better catch rates, mechanics to increase the odds of getting certain traits for your Pokemon, stuff like that which improve your quality of life in these games. But none of these things actually eliminate any of these problems, they all just reduce them, so that now a process that originally took 3 hours only takes 1. And that's better, but needing to waste an hour of your life every time you want to try to use a new Pokemon in a game that's about catching and using hundreds of different Pokemon is still ridiculous and still completely unacceptable. I really can't wrap my head around the logic for doing stuff like this. If the developers really thought these systems were fine, they wouldn't have to keep adding new tweaks 20 years later, since every game has had pretty much the exact same core mechanics, and 20 years is more than enough time to figure this out. But by adding new mechanics or shorten things in literally every single game, the developers are explicitly acknowledging that these systems take too long and aren't fun. So why are they keeping them in instead of fixing them outright? What's even crazier is that on top of the ridiculous time commitment for making teams, Pokemon also goes out of its way to make sure nobody even knows battling can be fun by making all of its mechanics completely inaccessible to players. At its best, Pokemon is one of the greatest one-on-one strategy games ever created. The sheer amount of creativity and variety there can be in competitive battling is staggering. The problem is that these games do basically everything in their power to prevent people from actually understanding and enjoying battles in this way, because the battle system is really complicated and almost none of it is properly conveyed to the player. The system starts out reasonably simple, with 17 different types of moves that can do bonus damage or less damage depending on the target Pokemon's type. Each move has a base power and an accuracy, and some moves have a special effect. Each Pokemon also has stats determining how much damage they do and how much damage they take. Most of this information is either directly presented to the player while they choose a move, or is easily accessible. And so far, this seems reasonable. But hold on, what do these numbers actually mean? Is a stat being at 150 good? How much damage can I expect a move with base 90 power to do? For some reason, this is information the developers absolutely do not want you to know. The games don't show you an estimate of the damage an attack will do, or a range of the percentage of health it will take, or even really how important any of these numbers are in determining how much damage you'll do. The game literally won't tell you anything. Already, this is a baffling decision that seems to go against the entire point of these games. But lucky for us, fans have taken apart the game's code and found the formula for damage calculations. So maybe we can try to use that to get a sense of the damage for ourselves. Or, maybe we don't. So that's not great, but our luck hasn't run out yet, because those same fans from earlier have also created damage calculators that will give you the precise damage that your attacks will do against a specific Pokemon. So maybe we can just use that instead in every battle. Or, on second thought, maybe we don't. Look, in some ways, the sheer complexity of the system is actually really good because it creates opportunities for lots of different types of Pokemon that can exist, and even more types of strategies that you could use in battles. But in most ways, as you can see, it's kind of insane, because as a game designer, not only do you have to figure out how to explain all this information to a new player that's just starting out, you also have to figure out a reasonable way to show all this information in real time so that players can appropriately plan out their moves. That's not to say there aren't ways to do that, it just requires a lot more thought and effort on the game designer's part. But the designers of Pokemon didn't do either of those things. While this is all of the information you need to know to calculate the damage, this is all of the information the games actually give you on the current state of the battle, and these are all the mechanics the games actually provide concrete information on at any point. All of these mechanics get at most a single sentence that gives you at best a vague description of how it works without giving you any specific numbers or the full list of effects it can have. However, the game designers have tried to address this problem by making the game so easy that you don't even need to understand any of this to beat them. And even if you do, you're not allowed to use any of your knowledge until after you finish the game. Any halfway decent game designer should realize this is a completely unacceptable result for a game. You don't create and maintain a system this complex for decades and then force players to use none of it. That is terrifically stupid. You either fix the system so it's not overly complex, or build the game around it properly, or both. The fact that the developers have chosen to do essentially nothing for 20 years is criminal. And look, what I'm saying here isn't just me complaining. This kind of analysis is literally the job description for what a game designer does. You come up with an idea or system, figure out how to teach the player, and create situations that force the player to use what they learned in fun and interesting ways. That is, to a certain extent, your entire job as a game designer. If players have too much trouble understanding or using the system, that means you either did a bad job of designing it, or did a bad job of explaining it. But either way, you need to fix it because that's your job. But the game designers of Pokemon are apparently just being paid to sit on their asses because they aren't doing anything to make the system work properly in the games. Because you aren't exposed to almost any of the complexity of the battling system, you're either playing the video game equivalent of a walking tour of a petting zoo, or you're being forced to sit through what is effectively a 10-hour-long tutorial for toddlers so that you can play the real game that is effectively being run and maintained by fans of this series. None of it makes any sense, and it's a complete waste of this entire franchise. At this point, you might be getting kind of annoyed with me, because it kind of just sounds like I'm asking Pokemon to turn their games into competitive battling simulators, which already exist for free online. But that's really not what I want. Ultimately, I just want the games to be less frustrating and more interesting for all players, regardless of who's playing, and I think that's really just a matter of taking the game's existing ideas further than they're currently willing to take them. For example, the games have already removed some of the randomness with catching Pokemon. You can find lots of Pokemon wandering around in the overworld, so you can be very deliberate with which one you want to fight and catch. There's no reason you can't just apply this to every Pokemon, so if you want to catch a specific one, it's more of a matter of finding the location it's in rather than wasting time running in circles. That just makes for a way more interesting gameplay experience, especially if the games go back to having fleshed out worlds with more side paths to explore. As for actually catching the Pokemon, there's no reason you shouldn't just be able to defeat the Pokemon and then be given the option to catch them. That's already the case for Dynamax raids, and I don't see why it can't apply to literally every capture. Catching cool Pokemon shouldn't be so time-consuming and frustrating, especially since most of the time it's just a matter of time until you catch a Pokemon, not a matter of skill. These two changes alone would just make the game more interesting, but it would work even better if they leaned into the battling system the developers created as well. So I know we discussed how complex the battling system is, but the truth is none of the individual mechanics that make up the system are really that complicated. The vast majority of them are just about changing percentages for different stats or damage. Where it can get confusing is in trying to figure out what everything does and then remembering what specific changes apply in which cases. Both of those problems should be really easy to solve. For starters, if you literally just add a UI element for the range of percentages a move can do given the current mechanics in play, it would dramatically simplify arguably the most confusing part. People can understand what an attack dealing 30% of health means, and can also understand that taking a turn to set up a mechanic that doubles that damage is good. Where it gets really challenging is when you have to do all of that math in your head and keep track of everything yourself. Having the game calculate and show the damage estimate will immediately make everything more accessible for pretty much every single person who's ever touched a Pokemon game. And again, the game already shows super basic information in battles, so it could easily replace that with information that's more clear and useful. In terms of teaching all of the mechanics, again, these games already have a system that should be perfect for this. Every Pokemon game ever made has some version of gym leaders, which each have their own specialty gimmick to challenge the player with. Right now, those gimmicks are all just variations on the same thing, which is just using Pokemon of one specific type and forcing players to counter that type with a different type. So what if instead of basically having the same challenge 12 times in a row, you have each gym leader focus on a different battling strategy? The first gym leader could be simple and teach the player the basics of type matchups, but then the next one could use weather strategies and teach the player how to use those, or status move strategies, or screens, or trick room, or whatever you want. And then, after beating that gym leader, you could have access to a new area with a bunch of Pokemon that are really good for that strategy. So you could build your own team using the tools you just learned and went up against. With this, players end up learning new strategies at a reasonable pace and even have the opportunity to use what they learned right away, and can be creative in combining strategies they've learned, sometimes by even just copying what they already saw. But we can take this even further and combine my two biggest issues with the games to make a way cooler experience. You can have mini dungeons focused on a specific gimmick, expose you to a Pokemon that work well with the gimmick, and at the end have a boss fight with a Pokemon that's super strong for the gimmick. For example, you could have a Trick Room dungeon, where you fight Pokemon that are good under Trick Room, and then at the end you fight a Hatterene that can set up Trick Room and utilize it really well, and if you beat it, you can catch it. With stuff like this, you can again learn more new strategies that maybe only apply to specific Pokemon, see which Pokemon are good for it, and then have an anchor to build around if you want to use the strategies yourself. Plus, this makes catching strong Pokemon way more rewarding than the way things are in the games now, because with this you have to actually overcome an interesting challenge to earn your Pokemon. There are other changes you'd have to make for this kind of game to reach its potential, specifically with making movesets significantly less restrictive and basically removing levels from the game entirely, but in general, none of what I'm suggesting is really that radical. This is all stuff that Pokemon is already supposed to be doing anyway. It's just a matter of taking the ideas that already exist in the games and using them to make a way more interesting and fun game. And you could very easily do that in a way that wouldn't alienate anyone, because again, most of these ideas aren't that complicated. If anything, putting the effort in would probably make the games way more approachable for more people. And I think that for as popular as the games are, this franchise is missing out on a lot of new players because the games have no real effort put into their gameplay. I personally know a lot of people who would probably love competitive battling or Pokemon in general, but none of them want to even touch the franchise because the games look like rock, paper, scissors simulators for kids. And honestly, they basically are right now. But they don't have to be, and they really shouldn't be, considering how much these games have to offer. It's really frustrating to see a franchise with so much promise be completely wasted by a company that doesn't seem to care about the product it puts out.